Hello and welcome to my latest video for how to paint Katakros, Mortarch of the Necropolis. In this video we're going to be looking at how to paint his blade, which is going to be done in a non-metallic metal style, and also the wrapping on the handle. To start with, here the paints I'm going to be using. You don't have to worry too much about getting the exact paints. I do prefer Vallejo for getting nice opaque covering. Just because it makes it easier to get like opaque covering down quickly, whereas the Games Workshops tend to be a little bit more translucent. But it really doesn't matter what use whichever paint company you prefer. But the idea with the greys is just that you get a tonal range going from dark to light. So I'm starting with neutral grey, and I'm just blocking in areas where it's going to catch some light to start with. Now these won't be the final. This won't be the final brightness of the highlights. It's just to give me a rough start. This curve here, because it's a curve, so it intensifies the light, and it's also upwards facing. So that little curve at the bottom there that I painted in first, that's probably going to be the lightest part on the blade, or one of the very lightest parts anyway. Obviously, the top section here that I'm painting in, I'll want to be kind of more of a focal point on the blade, so I will push the brightness on that, even though the curve isn't quite as extreme as it is on that little curve at the bottom. But so to counteract that, I'll make the actual bright area a wider band. You can see as well that I was using, so I've been using neutral grey to start with, because it's really nice and opaque. It's easy to get a very strong mark down, and then I've gone to the heavy blue-grey. Now I'm going to get a bit confused in this, but because I'm using heavy blue-grey, and I think there's some pale grey-blue on the top left of the wet palette there. I'm not actually too concerned about using the pale grey-blue, so if I do say that, you can probably ignore it. But anyway, just back to what I'm doing at the moment. You can see that I've blocked in with the neutral grey some the main highlight points. Now what you're going to see here on the top of the blade actually is I've started doing kind of like vertical curve blending areas on it, but later on it's going to be horizontal lines going into the blade, and that'll be to separate the blade out from the main flat edge, or not edge, the flat body of the blade. Excuse my hair getting in the way there. I've got myself a new lens on my camera to try and zoom in a bit more for you, and I've not positioned it very well, so you're getting a terrible view at the moment, but that'll vanish in a moment. Because it is a new lens and things, I'm having to get to grips a little bit with the positioning, so hopefully for future videos that's not going to be too much of an issue. So all I'm doing is kind of like a wet blending thing, where I'm quickly getting the paint from, so I'm applying the paint, the highlight colour, and then quickly going back to the German grey, and then blending it in before the previous colours dried. Here you can see I'm using the German grey just to pull back a little bit the highlight that I placed on the bottom of the blade edge. So you can see, because the idea is the bright highlights face upwards, and that highlight at the bottom, obviously it faces upwards on the upwards curve, but as it goes higher up, it actually starts to face downwards. So you're going to find that fixed as I go along. I am only human, so I do make mistakes sometimes when I'm planning out the highlights as I go along. But all it just takes is just a moment to actually look at what you're doing, and then it should make more sense. So that highlight that I just put in there, that's obviously upwards facing, so that's why that's a bright one up there. So here you can see I'm putting in more of the horizontal lines. You might be thinking the paint looks really thick. It looks thick because it's really opaque, but actually there's only a small amount of paint that I'm applying it, so I'm just using the very tip of the brush. And actually, if you look at the paint, like if you looked at the blade and you kind of tilted it a bit, you're not actually going to see much in the way of brush strokes. So by the time I finish this, it's going to look smooth still. So there's a difference between having opaque layers that are thin and paint that's, opaque layers that are thick, and it's very hard to see the difference until you tilt it, where you actually see like the bumpiness of the paint. So there's not actually any bumpiness of this, it's just that it's opaque paint as I'm applying it. But it just looks messy because of how opaque it is, and because I'm being messy as I apply it. But it doesn't matter at this stage about being super precise, because as I go along, once I've got all the base work done, then that's when you can start refining it and making it look good. It doesn't matter at this stage if it looks good or not, just as long as you kind of get as you're happy with the position of all the highlights and things. So you can see here it's still a little bit more kind of wet blending. So all I'll do is just swap between the colours, and then before they're dry, I can blend them in on the model as I go along. And also I'm not washing off the brush, obviously, so there's still some of the previous colour on the brush, makes it much easier to blend as well as you go along. Apologies if my voice sounds a bit off. My wife's managed to give me a cold. So hopefully I managed to struggle through doing the voiceover for this. For the highlight on the flat section of the blade in the middle, that's put there purely as a contrast point, a tonal contrast point against the highlights either side of it. It just makes it easier to make things stand out, having the light to dark, dark to light kind of effect on there. So you kind of it's a mix between realism and making it look good, because so realistic highlights sometimes won't look very good, and it's purely dependent on where the light source is, what angle the blade would be at, all sorts of things like that, as to whether the light source on the blade looks good or not. The reflections. So you just basically you're putting in your own reflections to make it look good. That little section there with the hook that goes out, I painted that in grey. It doesn't really need to be grey, but it just feels, because it's quite a large flat block of the blade there, and it just looks a little bit empty if you leave it kind of really dark, like black or German grey or whatever. And what you're actually going to find as well on the blade as we go along is I'm not going to do that much blending to make like perfect blends on it. I want these lines that I'm painting on to be quite visible, because it'll create a nice texture on it, just makes it look a little bit more interesting. And then the flat body of the blade will be smoother, and then so it'll then contrast against those two, having the smooth versus the textured. To get this kind of blending effect where you get kind of like the smooth blend using opaque paints, it works much better if you have the paint slightly thicker than normal. So I'd say something, just a touch thicker than single cream, because then it lets the paints actually blend. Whereas if it's runnier than that, if you added more water, the pigment tends to float around a little bit, because you have to apply quite a heavy amount of paint when you do it. Here I've got ice yellow. So this is to add a bit of colour to the blade, to the reflections. So this would be kind of like sunlight glinting in the blade, just adding that bit of warmth, which is also nice. It's a little bit of contrast because the colours that I've already put on the blade are quite cool. So there's some blues in there. It's very subtle blue, but there's blue in the heavy blue grey. Now another thing with these all these fine lines that I'm going to be painting on is it makes it kind of easier to blend. You have to be really careful and look at what you're doing, because the ice yellow is because you can't see what I'm doing, because the ice yellow is it's very, very white, and if you get that over some of the darker areas, it's going to stand out a lot. But like, you can keep building up the layers. Let's say you do the layers very, very finely. Don't do so. The marks that you've painted up to this point have been quite thick. These are much, much finer layers, lines. You're trying to make the tip of the brush only just graze against it. Also remember, when the first line, when you apply it, it's going to look a lot stronger than after it dries. So when it's wet, it's going to look really strong. As it dries, it's going to fade back, and it'll blend in more as you go along. So don't worry too much when you start applying it. I've got some P3 Morrow White here as well. This is obviously the final highlight brightness. This tones back some of the yellow a little bit, because you only want a slight hint of yellow on there. You don't want it too strong. But also it makes it look like the blade is extra shiny with that white going on there. And because the blade is so big and prominent on the model, you do want it to be quite a standout piece, and that this helps as well, having that extra brightness. So you can see there on the main edge of the blade, I added in a couple more reflections. It's exactly the same process as you've just seen, but it is they are kind of a little bit darker. So I did those highlights with the obviously starting with neutral grey and then not going any higher than the heavy blue grey. Don't forget as well, when you're applying these lines on there, that just because you've got you've put a highlight down doesn't mean to say that you can't take steps backwards, and if so, you can go back to the heavy blue grey or even the neutral grey, and always remembering that you don't need to wipe your brush off or wash it off in between these. But if you do, or if you don't wash it off, if you go for a white, then it's obviously going to go grey when you blend it in. And then the closer you get to the highest highlight point that you've already painted onto the blade, if you've left some of that grey on there, it's going to start showing up. So be really careful. If you've got grey on the brush and then you pick some white on there, you need to start highlight. So whatever point you start highlighting at, you need to move it away from the central highlight, because the more lines that you do, the grey it's going to be as the grey mixes in with the white that you've just put on the brush. Now you're trying to these lines, you're trying to keep them sort of so they match the curve of the blade. So they're not all parallel. That it's kind of like if you carried on the shape going around it, you would end up with a big circle. But you're also looking to not have too big a gap. So you sort of like going over the lines sometimes. And tweaking them, because obviously for the shape of it, the lines will seem tighter at the intersection of the circle, and then they would flare outwards, which would mean there'd be a big gap right on the very edge of the blade, and that would look bad. So you have to go over and over the lines on top of them to fill in these gaps while still keeping the lines, so they look natural and kind of like so it makes it look like they're parallel, but they're not, because obviously they're curving a little bit each time. I really can't apologise enough for having my head in the way on these shots. It is a problem, but I will definitely get it fixed for the later videos. So you can see I'm just going over and over and over with these lines, just looking for little faults in there, because I do want the lines to be visible though, so you don't want to completely wipe out all of the lines. If you wanted to, that is fine as well. You just get a very smooth finish, and one way that you could do that would be glazing. So once you've got all these lines on there, and you've blended it as much as you feel you can, just using the line work, what you can do is then water down all these colours that you have, and then just glaze over the mid-tone. So if you're glazing white, you'd glaze from like a tone lower than the white up towards the white, and you just keep doing that. And then whichever way you glaze, if it's darker than the paint next to it, you glaze away from it. If it's lighter than the paint next to it, you glaze towards it. I think that makes sense. Like if you wanted to paint white, then you paint the white towards the highest highlight, and if you want to paint a darker colour, you glaze towards the darker direction. You can see here I'm just painting in the edges. This is quite important. The edges, I think I've said this in nearly every video, edges catch more light, because they are focusing the light on like a very extreme curve. You saw there as well when I painted the edge on. So a thing with models is they tend not to have sharp edges on weapons. They're a little bit rounded, and if you don't quite get it right, the edge highlight can be a bit thick, which can be a problem where you just rely on the very edge of the brush to paint in the edge highlight. Sometimes it can be a case of painting an edge highlight, you just end up having to use the tip of the brush and painting it in smoothly yourself, because otherwise the edge highlight will be too thick, and that's because the curve on the edge is just, it's not extreme enough. So these are obviously very, very delicate lines, and you just keep going over and over and over them. And on this top section of the blade as well, the important part is that you're not having a big tonal jump between each line that you put down. Now you can see there I was using the heavy blue grey and I was going towards the white section. I have to stop before I get to the white section, or the tonal jump between the heavy blue grey and the white is quite high. And also don't forget as well, there's the ice yellow on there as well. And because the tonal jump is, once it gets a little bit high, the lines start to become much more visible. You want to keep the lines purely within like the small tonal range where they kind of blend in. You can see every now and then I catch the flat body of the blade with these marks. Don't worry about that at all. Now I know I've blended a little bit on the main body of the blade, but I haven't spent a lot of time on it doing it neatly. So really don't worry about that. It's more important that you get the marks kind of consistent with the lightness of touch and just the positioning. And if you end up just catching other parts of the blade while you're doing that, just don't worry about it. You can come back to those because it's much easier to get in the soft blend afterwards. And here you can see I'm just going back, I'm using the German grey and just going over the edge, up to the edge rather, where I've been going over with these horizontal lines. And what you can see here straight away is just by painting in that little section there, neatening it up, how much better that looks just by taking away all those overspill lines basically. So here I've done the same thing on the lower section of the blade that we've just been doing on the main section. So I went back and I used the ice yellow and the P3 Morrow White and just picked out some of those reflections. Now obviously these reflections are a lot smaller than the main blade, so they don't need quite as much work. Here's me blocking your view again. The tail sounds of my dog coming to say hello as well. Or one of my dogs rather. Go away. So what I'm actually doing is just picking out the edges on the main flat of the blade, and that was using the heavy Bluegrey, and then I'm using the ice yellow as well, just to pick out as a highlight. I'm not using the P3 Morrow White because I need that just to pick out the highest highlight points, and I don't want to just take every edge up to pure white. I really feel bad for how my head keeps getting in the way. So now here we're back to neutral grey. I'm just going to work on this little shiny point on the top and the flat of the body of the blade. I'm just kind of like doing small swirly marks. The paint has gone a little bit watery, so I'm not getting as smooth a finish as I want, but as they dry, those kind of sort of fade into the background. But you'll see, it's going to get blended a little bit better. Also, at the base of the blade here, I'm highlighting it a bit more. Now, this part you have to be careful. Don't highlight this too close to the edge of the blade, because then you'll kill the highlight there. You need that to be dark next to the edge that you're painting in, those horizontal lines that you painted in, especially, and this little curve at the bottom. It needs to be dark next to that to make that look like it's shiny. But at on the flat of the blade, right as it touches the staff, I think I'll paint it like a bony colour. So the section that's holding the blue gem anyway, as that touches there, it needs to be highlighted, because that's going to have some of the reflection from that part of the staff onto the blade. And so that's why I'm pushing the highlight a little bit there. And also this will create a little bit of contrast, because that part that holds the blade is darker than the blade itself. So there I was using the ice yellow. Let's do kind of like a little spot highlight on the centre of the blade, and now I'm going back to the heavy Bluegrey and just blending in around it. The thing, heavy Bluegrey is a little bit tricky, because you might have noticed now as I apply that, it looks really, really light, but then it goes much darker as it dries. So these little marks that you keep here, so build them up, going over and over. The more that you apply them, you have to pay attention. You're looking for kind of faults in it, but the more that you go over that, the smoother the blending gets. And you're just looking for little faults. Don't just keep going over the same area. constantly. Now, you see there, I'd use some of the neutral grey to blend it in, and actually the neutral grey was much too dark tonally in comparison to the heavy blue grey. And what I'm just doing here is mixing the German grey and the neutral grey together, so I've got a tone in between the two of them. It just helps to blend it a bit as well. So there you see, it just instantly becomes a little bit softer. But again, you have to be careful, because you see the big curve on the edge of the blade that we spent ages putting all those little lines on. That needs dark right next to it, so it has to stay German grey right to the edge of that to keep that hard edge and to keep the tone contrast high. So the difficulty that I'm having here, I mean, it's not really that difficult, but is that it's a small area to blend, to get a smooth blend in while keeping the areas dark that you need to be. If you're just doing a blend and it didn't matter too much, you could just go up to that edge there, and you allow yourself a larger area, and just to decrease the tonal range. So it's easy to blend something as long as in a shorter tonal range, whereas like if you have going from white to black in a small area, you have to get that blending done smoothly but very quickly. Whereas if you're just doing light grey to medium grey, then you've got a much larger it's just much easier to get that blending there, because you've got a smaller range to get through. So in this video, I can see actually that where I've got the blend up to the German grey, it's quite visible on the screen, but actually when you hold the model in your hand, it's not visible at all, that step between the German grey and what would be a mix of neutral grey and German grey. So that's kind of interesting. But anyway, here I'm just using I'm using a few separate colours actually. So on the darkest sections, I'm using just neutral grey to pick out these. I'm guessing it's some sort of script. So it's neutral grey on the sections that go into the German grey highlight in the background, not highlight, like base colour in the background. But then as these little text bits go into the more highlighted colours, then it'll go up to heavy blue grey, but not white, and you'll see why. So I've gone through and I've finished putting that edge highlight around all of these little texty bits. Now the P3 Morrow White, this is just like a little dot highlight. This only goes on extreme edges, so that would be either a concave or a convex curve, but it has to be a curve. Like the hard white line doesn't go on anything that's just a flat surface. So you can see there, in anything that's recessed or prominent, it gets a white dot, otherwise it's not. That makes it kind of like it pushes the contrast, so it just makes it look a bit more shiny. And this is one of these things where I say you have to be really careful with how much white you use on something. So if I'd just gone around and I'd given all of these little squiggles, if I just given them all white edge highlights, which you could be tempted to do because it'll make them stand out really strongly, but once you've done that, then you can't highlight them because you can't go any higher than white. That's my dog again. You can see there I made a small mistake. So on the letter that looks kind of like an H, I put white dots on the base of it, and those they're too big. They just look messy. So I'm going to have to go back and fix that, and I'm going to have to use the base colour of the highlight the blade highlight underneath it to blend that back in again. So we're coming up to the end of the tutorial for how to paint the blade, and we're going to be moving on to the wrapping soon. But I just wanted to talk about a couple of extra things that you can do to the blade, just to make it a bit more interesting. And this is something I actually did to it, and I forgot to record. But if you take a small amount of Rhinox hide, water it down, any part of the blade that is facing downwards, or if it's a dark area, glaze some Rhinox hide into it, and that'll be that will then show reflections of the ground all around it. So it will also add a nice bit of contrast against the blue of the highlights. But a nice place to put it on is, if you see on the main blade that where we spent all that time putting those all those lines on, just underneath that there is a little section and it curves downwards. If you glaze into there, that shadowed area with the Rhinox hide, that will be an inverted reflection of the ground underneath it. And then at the bottom of the blade, where we've got that nice little hook that faces upwards, just above that, the blade again curves downwards and there's a little dark reflection there. If you glaze the Rhinox hide into that, again it'll be an inverted reflection of the ground in there. And then you can do the same thing with anything facing upwards, although you have to be a little bit careful with that. But you can glaze in some blue for the sky. Now, I didn't put any blue on because I've already got blue mixed in with the heavy blue grey. But anyway, now we're moving on to the handle of the spear. This is actually really simple. But it's also a little bit irritating because there's so much wrap on the handle. Also, just while you can see it actually on the screen, if you see when my head gets out of the way, the blade, I talked about the reflection of where the blade is held by the. So I've painted it as the non-metallic green, same as I have done for the chest material. So I just took some of that same green highlight and I just put it just on the edge of the blade, and that creates a nice little reflection of that colour in there. But anyway, onto the wrapping. And so as I say, it's quite an irritating sort of thing to paint. And all I'm doing is I'm just taking the colour and just picking out each section of the wrapping. Now, what I want with the highlights on this is that it gets a much stronger highlight up around the fingers and the hand, and as it fades down into the bottom of the staff, it's going to get darker, and the highlights going to be there's hardly going to be any highlights there basically. But you can't do that well with just one colour. But I mean, you're going to see how I achieve that as we go along. But one of the things that you can use here is the translucency of the paint. So what you can see here is, as I apply it and it dries, it goes darker, and that's some of that is showing the primer underneath it. So you're not getting a perfectly opaque coverage every time you apply the paint, and you can use that and do multiple layers on the sections that you want highlighted higher. However, obviously we're going to use some of the other colours to push the highlights even further. So you don't have to worry too much about that, but it is a useful technique. So in some ways, if you really wanted, you could just about highlight the whole staff just using one colour by relying on the translucency of the paint to show the black primer. But the problem is that it doesn't look that neat because the paint, obviously if it isn't opaque, gets a little bit patchy. Now what you can do is, again, use that to your advantage and use that as a texture. I'm going to do that a small amount, but the texture that I'm going to paint in is going to be with the highlighted colours later on, really. But if you wanted and you didn't want the staff wrapping to be light at all, you, instead of doing these kind of dirty layers and then just going back and highlighting them up a bit further up the staff, you could just paint all vertical lines on each one of these wraps as it goes round. Very similar in the way that we did the blade edge, actually. You could do these vertical lines going down it, and it'll make it look kind of like bandage wrapping, and it put a nice bit of texture on there. And you can keep going over with these vertical lines. So you can see as I'm applying it, I am doing it in vertical line, or generally vertical line marks. So it is adding a bit of texture on there, because I don't want these to be very clean and neat looking. Again, I want it to be dirty and kind of old and grimy. So I do want some of that primer showing through. You're going to see in a moment that there we go. I've finished sort of blocking in the whole of the wrapping. It quite clearly it's not very clean. The painting that I've done on it, it's not super neat. It's just a case of sort of filling it in and getting the marks in that vertical direction, because it just, it looks a little bit nicer. So now we're going to the highlight colour, or rather the first highlight colour, which is Morghast Bone. So obviously we used Zandri dust for the first kind of blocking in colour, and the Morghast Bone is, it's just a tonal step higher, really. In fact, all of the colours, they're all kind of like a creamy sort of bone highlight, and it just gives me a nice tonal range. If you wanted, you could just start with the Zandri dust, and for each step just add a bit more white to it, and you get a very similar result. Although the Morghast Bone has a touch more yellow in it, for a touch more warmth. It just depends if you want that or not. But you're doing exactly the same process here as you did with the Zandri dust, but you kind of making the area smaller. But remember when I said that I want the highlights around the hand to be brighter, and then they get duller as you go further down the staff, because I'm trying to do more of a dramatic lighting look to the piece, or rather keeping the top half of the model at least being brighter, and then you should see as well for the main body of the model, as it goes down around the legs and things, it gets duller, so the staff has to match that as well. You could see there when I added the Morghast Bone, I had the paint a little bit, I hadn't wiped off on the brush very well, but it didn't matter. I just went back over it and spread the paint out a little bit. Now on this stage where you're adding the Morghast Bone, kind of look for the shapes on the wrappings, because what you'll notice is certain parts, so the wrappings aren't flat, obviously. They have like little curves, and the top part and the bottom part of each wrap has it is more prominent, and then in the middle it kind of like goes into a sort of a little recess. So if you pick out the edges, although it's not, I don't want to say that you're edge highlighting it, but you are picking out the more prominent sections. And the reason I don't want to say you're edge highlighting it is because you don't want it to be a really sharp edge, which will actually flatten it. You're looking for the sections that look like they would face upwards. So it's just a very gentle curve, but it's a slight curve upwards, which basically just means if there's a top-down light, it would be a fairly blocky lower section. And the other thing is as well, so remember I was saying about getting texture in these. Now again, because these are the brightest parts, I don't need to worry too much about getting the texture in. And if I start putting the texture into, or rather, if I started putting texture in with the highest highlight colours before going through the range of the tones, the contrast on the texture would be too high, and it would actually be a bit jarring. So I have to keep going through the stages. So using Zandri dust, then Morghast bone, then Screaming Skull, then the white. To do that, so that the tonal step with the texture just isn't too harsh, because it needs to be similar steps in between the tonal, in between the textures. So I can add textures that are darker lower down, just by using whatever highlight one stage higher, and then keep that process going as I get higher up the staff, but just by picking the next highest highlight. So the highlights around the hand where I put these vertical texture lines in. So those will be done with Screaming Skull and Morrow White, whereas the texture marks lower down, they'll be done with the Morghast bone. Although the texture marks lower down are going to be much less visible as well, because I'm going to glaze over a little bit with some Rhinox hide, and that will just kind of soften them a bit. But also it's to knock the bottom of the staff back even further with the brightness, just so it kind of blends in more with the body of the model. You can probably see on the shoulder there's a big gap on his cloak. The cloak is obviously not glued on yet, and I could really been doing this painting without the model attached, but I actually left the model on for this purely so that I can match the highlights to the rest of the body. I mean, you can see a little bit on the back of the arm there as well that it's not super highlighted yet. I haven't painted all of the back on him because I'm going to paint that separately, and I need to get like all the model mainly done before I start working on the back. But the main thing I want to talk about is that crack, that big gap in between the back of the cloak and the front of the cloak on his shoulder. I am going to do a video specifically on how to fix that, because it's obviously it's quite a problem, because once you've painted it all and you glue it together, that line is going to be really visible, and there are a few tricks that I know that can help you to completely conceal that without destroying all your paintwork. So here you can see I'm doing those vertical lines that I was talking about, and how they now don't stand out too far to the rest of the model. The lines that I painted on further down, because the base coat underneath them was already quite highlighted. So here you can see I'm using the Morghast bone, and I can then pick out some of the these texture marks again. These are lower down on the staff, so the Morghast bone is as high as I need to go, and it still makes them visible. Obviously they dry a little bit darker than I apply them anyway. It kind of hints at them a little bit more than is very distinct with showing them. But then back on this top section up near the fingers, I can then go straight up to P3 Morrow White. Now I say you can go straight up to that, but you have to be careful because you're just picking out very small amounts of this. You don't want the staff to be overpowering on the model too much again, especially because you're actually using very, very similar colours to the bone on his body. Now, they are different colours, but they're close. So, especially because the white actually is the same colour that is on him and the Screaming Skull. So, part of it is separating it out with these textures. So these vertical lines are actually quite important because they do make the staff wrapping look separate to his body, based on texture. So it's not colour that's separating it as such, although there's no Bale or brown on there, so you don't get those warm colours as much, whereas the warm colours are obviously much more visible on the body itself. And then you can see as we go further down on the staff, it gets much darker, but that matches the legs on the model. So here it is, like in a much clearer picture now. So I mentioned I did glaze in some Rhinox hide right at the bottom of the staff. It's not super important to do that, but I just did it quickly afterwards while looking at it, because I felt that it just needed, it makes it look a little bit grubbier at the bottom and sort of matches the cloak right next to it. But anyway, that's the end of this video. I hope my head didn't get in the way too much to spoil your viewing pleasure. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.